morning, Year 6. It's Miss Ahad with another reading lesson. So we are going to continue with the Explorer. As you know, we've read on now, so we know what's happened. So I'd like you to pause the video and let me know who are the 4 new characters we've been introduced to. Pause the video and name the characters. So we knew already one character, which was Fred. We now know Max, Lila, and Con. So let's start with our vocabulary today. I'm going to have my turn and then you're going to repeat after me. Our first word is an adjective, and that is sodden. This means something that is saturated with liquid, especially water. So the material is almost soaked through. It's sodden. In a sentence, we could say, after she came back from jumping in puddles, her clothes were sodden, which means soaked through with water. The next word, another adjective, is accustomed. And this means to become used to. In a sentence, you could say, for example, Fred became accustomed to the dark, which means he became used to the dark. Our next word, which is a verb, is scrambled. And this means to make one's way quickly or awkwardly up a steep gradient over rough ground by using usually your hands or feet. So in a sentence, we could say, during her daily walks, she scrambled up the steep hillside over the rocks to watch the beautiful view. Scrambled. We then have an adjective which is unbearable. And this means to not be able to endure or tolerate, so you cannot take something. For example, in a sentence, I could say, the heat in Dubai in July is unbearable, which means I can't take it because it's too hot. Another verb, which is clustered, and this means to be grouped together or bunched together, for example. So you could say the students clustered around the guest speaker to hear his stories, or you could say the bananas are clustered together, which means bunched together at the supermarket. Another verb, which is entwined, and this means to wind or twist together, almost having an interweave. So you can see here the tree branches have been entwined together, which means they have been twisted together. In a sentence, I could say the roses entwine the little cottage, which means that roses were twisted round the little cottage. We then have another verb, which is convulse. And this is to shake violently or uncontrollably. So in a sentence, I've used it in this way, and that is a racking cough convulsed her whole body, which means the cough was so bad it was shaking her body violently. Then we have another verb, which is barely. And this means something that's hardly there or scarcely, there's not enough left. So you could say in the sentence here, looking at this image, there was barely any Sunday roast left. My brother had eaten it all. Barely. Lastly, we have another adjective, which is bitter. And this means a feeling of showing anger or hurt or resentment because of a bad experience. So you could say my friend was bitter towards me because I ate all of his chocolates. Bitter. We're now going to go back and read the words together. So I'd like you to pause the video each time and say back the word. Okay, so sodden, accustomed, scrambled, unbearable, clustered, entwined, convulse, barely, bitter. Okay, now we're going to start our activity. We're going to have a look at our vocabulary activity, and this is, firstly, we need to circle 2 antonyms in each of these sentences. Well, before I start my activity, I need to know if I know what an antonym is. So I'd like you to pause the video and have a go. Do you remember what an antonym is? Well done if you said it's a word that is opposite in meaning to another. So let's look at it in context. So I was accustomed to being the only child at a table of adults, so it wasn't an unusual experience for me. So firstly, I know that accustomed is one of my key vocabulary words, which means to become used to. So I'm going to circle this word here. Now, I was accustomed to being the only child at a table full of adults, so it wasn't an unusual experience for me. Well, I know I'm looking for an antonym, so I need to find a word that is different, that is opposite in meaning to accustomed. So accustomed means becoming used to. I need to find a word that means I was fine with it. So I was used to the experience. So I know that unusual means it wasn't an unusual experience. So in this context, it means it wasn't something that they weren't used to. She was used to sitting at a table of adults. Okay, so that's my first sentence where I've underlined both the antonyms. So I have accustomed and then the antonym. So the opposite of accustomed is unusual. I'd like you to pause the video now and have a go at the other two sentences. Remember, you're showing yourself that integrity and honesty to mark along your work once you have finished. So come back to the video once you've finished. My next sentence is, the pitch is sodden, which means wet. It's soaked through with liquid. So in this instance, it's probably some water. The match is cancelled until we have a spell of dry weather, remarked a referee to the disgruntled players. So I'm going to underline sodden here, because I know that sodden means soak through. I've spotted the antonym in this sentence. Have a look. Have you also spotted that dry is the opposite to soak through, and that is why we should underline dry. Let's have a look at our next sentence. The long wait was almost unbearably, so luckily the pain was manageable. Unbearably, another one of my keywords. I'm going to underline unbearably. I'd like you to pause the video and have a look. Do you remember what unbearably means? Well done if you said it means not being able to endure or tolerate pain. They cannot take it. So the long wait here was they couldn't take the long wait. So luckily the pain, so there wasn't really any pain from it, was manageable. They could deal with that pain. So I'm going to underline manageable. So the long wait was almost unbearable. So luckily the pain was manageable. Now we're going to look at our next three sentences, and this time make sure you read the heading clearly. It's asking you to circle two synonyms. I want you to pause the video. Do you remember what a synonym means? Well done if you said a synonym is a word that means exactly the same as the word you're looking for. So for example, if you said beautiful, you could also say picturesque. That would be another synonym for beautiful. They mean exactly the same thing. So let's read the sentence together. He had been working feverishly to win the prize for his teammates, who leapt in delight and danced around the room excitedly when the winner was announced. So I need to look for a synonym in the sentence. Well, my keyword is fever. So firstly, I've underlined feverishly and excitedly. And the reason why I've underlined both feverishly and excitedly, because they are synonyms of each other. Feverishly can have two different meanings. Firstly, it could be symptoms of having a fever, or someone being described as being quite excited. In this context, a synonym for feverishly is excitedly, as it is talking about someone feeling quite excited. Secondly, I've underlined jealous and bitter, and that is because firstly, bitter is one of our key words, and this is showing a feeling of anger or hurt or resentment to someone, and that is a synonym, and you can find jealous as a synonym of bitter. And then lastly, I've underlined hardly and barely, and that is because firstly, barely means for something to be quite scarce, not enough. So in this context, there's hardly, which is also, you could find a synonym of hardly as barely. There's not enough food left in the fridge to make pancakes, which is why hardly is a synonym. So let's go on to our next activity. Please get hold of your second activity for reading so we can do this together. Well done for marking your work. We are now going to go on to our second activity today, and that is to fill in the blanks in our sentences. What I advise is read out the sentences to yourself first without the missing word. So for example, the intense earthquake caused the entire office to rattling the building as the floors buckled. This helps you to understand the context of the sentence. Well, I know firstly the sentence is talking about an earthquake happening and almost that the buildings were shaking. I'm going to look at my different words that I have available. And I know that convulse actually means to shake violently. So this is the word that will go into the sentence, and I'm going to read it out again. The intense earthquake caused the entire office to convulse, rattling the buildings as the floors buckled. I'd like you now to pause the video and have a go at the activity. Please do not continue with the video until you have finished so you can mark along honestly. Our next sentence, which is, wouldn't it be something special to find a whole bunch of stars something together? I've written clustered because that means grouped or bunched together. And definitely that would be very special. We next have, we something spoke the entire time we were in the car. Make sure you're marking along as I'm talking. So we barely spoke the entire time we were in the car. Barely means we didn't really speak the entire time. The next sentence, the giraffes entwined, which means twisted their necks in the most astonishing manner. So it was lovely to watch. We then have, she arrived early enough to get her accustomed seat in the front row. Our next sentence, more than 3 million fans are expected to scramble for tickets to see Kanye West perform in concert next year. Our next sentence, in order to win the $1 million prize, the teams worked feverishly, which means they were working excitedly in this context to complete the final obstacle course. And then lastly, if there's one thing that will make me bitter towards my friends, it is when they play a prank on me that is too far serious to be considered a prank. So bitter in this instance, it makes them feel quite angry towards their friends. So please make sure you're marking along and upload your work onto Seesaw. Well done if you got 100%. If you haven't, make sure you correct your mistakes and learn those sentences in context. Well done, Year 6. Let's get on to reading now. It was a girl's voice. Well, I know now that the voice belongs to a girl, but before, when we read on last week, Fred was quite scared because he heard a sudden voice and he was throwing things because he felt really scared after the plane had crashed. But now we know the voice belongs to a girl. Fred looked out from behind the tree. The light of the moon filtered deep green to the forest floor, casting long-fingered shadows against the trees, and he could see only 2 bushes, both of them rustling, suggesting that both of the bushes were moving. Who is it? Who's there? The voice came from the second bush. Fred squinted through the dark, feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. Squinted? Well, that was one of my key vocabulary words from last week. I'd like you to pause the video and have a go if you remember the definition. Well done if you said squinted means look. We'll look at something with your eyes partly closed. So here it suggests that Fred is squinting through the dark because he could barely see as it was so dark. Feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. Oh, again, remaining hair. Remember his hairs were burnt. They were singed and charred because of all the smoke coming from the crashed aeroplane, which is why he hasn't got many hairs left on his arm. Please don't hurt us, said the second bush. The accent wasn't British. It was something softer, and the voice was definitely a child's, not an adult. Was it you throwing poo? Fred looked down at the ground. He snatched up a piece of years-old fossilized animal dung. Years-old fossilized animal dung suggests that it was old animal poo. Oh, yes. Oh, he said. Yes. He was becoming accustomed to the dark. Oh, accustomed is one of my key vocabulary words for this week. Well, accustomed means becoming used to. So here it suggests that Fred has become used to the dark. He could see the shine of eyes peering out from the grey-green gloom of the undergrowth. Are you from the plane? Are you hurt? Yes, we are hurt. We fell out of the sky, said one bush, as the other said, no, not badly. You can come out, said Fred. It's only me here. The second bush parted. Fred's heart gave a great leap. Both the girl and her brother were covered in scratches and burns and ash, which had mixed with sweat and rain and made a kind of paste on their faces. But they were alive. He was not alone. You survived, he said. Obviously we did, said the first bush. Or we'd be less talkative, wouldn't we? The blonde girl stepped out into the lashing rain, here suggesting that the rain, it was quite heavy rain. She stared from Fred to the other 2, unsmiling. I'm Con, she said. It's short for Constantia, but if you call me that, I'll kill you. Fred glanced at the other girl, which means he looked at the other girl. She smiled nervously and shrugged. Right, he said. If you say so. I'm Fred. I'm Lila, said the second girl. She held her brother on her hip. And this is Max. Well, I know from all the different names, there's 4 characters we have been introduced to thus far. Hi. Fred tried to smile, but it made the cuts on his cheek stretch and burn, so he stopped and made do with a grin that involved only the left half of his face. Max was at the breathless stage of crying, suggesting he was crying quite a lot. And he clung to his sister so tightly his fingers were pressing bruises on her skin. She was leaning over to one side to hold him up, shaking with the effort. They looked Fred thought, like a two-headed creature, arms entwined. Entwined is another one of our key words. Remember, could you pause the video and let me know what does entwined mean? Well, entwined means almost went together or twisted together. Interweaved, which means here, in this context, it means their arms were twisted together because he was so scared she was holding on to him. Is your brother badly hurt? He asked. Lila patted her brother desperately on the back. He won't talk. He's just crying. Con looked back towards the fire and shivered. The flames cast a light on her face. She was no longer blonde. Her hair was grey with soot and brown with blood, and she had a scratch on her shoulder that looked deep. Are you all right? He asked, wiping rain out of his eyes. That cut looks bad. No, I'm not all right, Con spat. We are lost in the Amazon jungle, and statistically speaking, it's very likely we are going to die. Amazon jungle, well, we've now been told where the children are. I know. Fred didn't feel he needed reminding. I meant... So no. Con's voice grew thin and high. I think it would be safe to say that none of us are all right. Not at all. Not even slightly. The bushes rustled, again suggesting that the bushes were moving, maybe because of the wind. The rain hammered down on Fred's face, again suggesting that it's pouring with rain. Look at the language and the adjectives used to describe the weather. We need to find shelter, he said. A big tree or a cave or something that would... No, Max gave a sudden scream, a yell that was wet with spit and fear. Fred stepped backwards, raising his hands. Don't cry. I just thought... Then his eyes followed Max's pointing finger. There, 3 inches from Fred's shoe, was a snake. It was speckled brown and black, patchworked to match the jungle floor, and its head was big as a fist. Again, the adjectives here suggesting that the snake actually camouflaged in with the jungle floor, so patchworked to match the jungle floor. For 1 second, nobody breathed. The jungle waited. Then Max let out a second scream that dug deep into the night, and the 4 of them turned and fled, which means that 4 of them turned and ran away. They fled from the scene. The ground was sudden, and they ran pell-mell. Oh, sudden's another one of our key words for this week. Pause the video and have a go and see if you remember. Well, sudden means to be soaked through. It usually means a material that's quite wet. And they ran pell-mell, which means quite frantically. Sending up mud into one another's eyes and grazing their elbows against trees. Grazing is another synonym for almost scratching their elbows. Fred ran as if his body were not his own, faster than he'd ever run, his palms stretched ahead of him. He tripped over a root and turned a full somersault, coming up, spitting earth. He ran on. The rain blinded him and shadows flashed past him in the darkness. There was a yell behind him. Please, Max, said Lila. Fred turned back, skidding in the mud. He won't run. Lila bent over her brother. And I can't carry him. The little boy lay on his back, weeping up at the sky, his whole body shaking in the driving rain. Come on! Fred heaved Max over his shoulder, which means he put Max over his shoulder. The boy was far heavier than he'd expected, and he screamed as Fred lifted him. But Fred grabbed both of Max's knees and started running, his whole body screaming with pain, suggesting that Fred's body was in quite a lot of pain. He could hear Lila, her feet thumping close behind them. The stitch in Fred's side was almost unbearable, again suggesting that he couldn't tolerate the stitch. It was quite painful. When he tore out of the trees and into a sudden clearing, he halted, and Max bumped his head against Fred's spine and yelled. Angrily, he began trying to bite one of Fred's shoulder blades. Please don't, said Fred, but he was barely paying attention to the boy on his back. He stared, stunned, ahead of him. They were standing at the edge of a wide circle of trees, open to the sky lit by a fat moon. There was a carpet of green moss and grass, and the stars above them were clustered. Oh, clustered is another one of our vocabulary words, and that means gathered round or bunched together. So here they were gathered so thickly that the silver outnumbered the night. Fred lowered Max to the ground and stood bent over, his hands on his thighs, panting, again suggesting he's quite out of breath as he's carrying Max, who's quite heavy. "Do the snakes taste us?" said Max. "No," gasped Con. "How do you know?" wailed Max. Lila dropped to her knees, clutching at her sides. "Snakes don't, Maxie. We both know that. I just panicked," said Con. Her voice was bitter, all again suggesting she's quite angry. "That's what happened. See? Look. No snakes. We were stupid. Now we're even more lost." The ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over it, his muscles aching and sniffed. It smelt of rotting things, but he was feverishly thirsty. Again, suggesting here the word feverishly thirsty, suggesting that Fred has come up as maybe coming up with a fever. And even from the language used, adjectives used to describe how his muscles and body are feeling, suggests that he's going to come up with a fever as his body is in so much pain.